Assalamualaikum and good morning, everyone. I'm glad to be here today. We have actually thank you. I would like to thank you for organizer to invite me from Malaysia. I'm from Malaysia, from Management and Science Universities. So this is actually a very good title. Yeah, Disruption Era: How should business and government respond? So it's very much relevant. Yeah. So without further ado, we have two panels that will be with us today for the discussions. We have esteemed members from Deakin Universities, Associate Professor Dr. Joshua Newton, the Director of Research in the Department of Marketing at Deakin Universities, to give a speech. Right? Come, Doctor.
Selamat pagi, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I wanted to, first of all, before I start, just say thank you to Airlangga University for inviting me to come and to talk about a topic that is of importance not just for Indonesia, not just for the region, but also for the world. How I'm going to approach my presentation, I'm going to focus upon three features of disruption. Now, disruption is a recent concept. It was a concept that was identified by a Harvard professor in 1995, but it's also a concept that has been with us since the dawn of human civilization. But there are three features that I think are particularly interesting around disruption as we're currently seeing it. So I want to focus upon those three particular features. And then I'm going to present a brief case study drawing upon some work that I've done in a particular sector back in Australia that help hopefully to give a little bit of an insight into how these particular features look, and then also what government and what business can do to actually try to address disruption in this particular sector. So the first feature is the consumer as a producer. One of the interesting elements of disruption as we currently see it is that firms are no longer necessarily developing a brand new product and having that as their central feature for their disruptive innovation. Instead, they're developing technologies or tools that can help us as consumers go out and actually find ways of earning income or of contributing to some broader community. I've got three examples. Some of them have already been discussed, so I won't belabor them too much. The first one is Airbnb. The interesting thing around Airbnb is that there were two Silicon Valley graduates. They were trying to get to a conference. There was no accommodation for them that was available. And so what they did is they looked around and tried to find ways in which other people would be able to provide them and people like them with relatively cheap accommodation. And so the insight here is that they were able to develop a suite of tools that would allow people like you and me to actually hire out our spare bedrooms or maybe a rental house so that we could in turn derive some degree of profit over and above what would otherwise have been the case. The second example is YouTube. YouTube is a technology that allows all of us to effectively become our own television stations. And if you think about that for a few moments, it's actually quite a revolutionary piece of technology. If we were to think back to the 50s or the 60s, as television was starting to become more popular, we would never have thought that we ourselves, in many respects, people's lifetimes, would actually be able to develop our own television stations, that we could produce content that millions or even billions of people around the world could actually gain access to. And so this, again, is emblematic of the fact that technology, disruptive technology, is allowing people like us to actually produce content or tools or things like accommodation for other people. The third feature, or the third example for this feature, is Wikipedia. This is an encyclopedia, as I'm sure all of you are familiar with, that has actually displaced a venerable encyclopedia, the Encyclopedia Britannica. And they were able to do it because people like you and me were being empowered and given the tools to produce content around things that they knew, providing that available for people for free, and in the process developing a huge breadth and depth of information in a way that had not previously been the case. So that's the first example, the first feature that I wanted to draw attention to. The second is that many disruptive technologies are now providing a technology platform as opposed to a technology product. A really good example here is the Apple App Store. So if you were to think about a mobile phone, the Apple iPhone itself was a really good product. It was an innovative product, but it wasn't a disruptive product in the sense that it wasn't a market entrant that was aiming at the lower end of the market, which is typically what defines disruption. What was interesting and disruptive about the Apple iPhone, however, is that it was providing a platform that allowed other organizations to deliver material, software to people. It was empowering and allowing other organizations or other individuals to deliver new ways of looking at technology, new ways of producing content and delivering that content to people. And so me, with my iPhone, I now no longer need a radio because I use my phone. I no longer need to have a watch because I have my phone. I no longer need to even use often a laptop because I have my phone. So in this particular way, one technology and the platform that sits across it has been able to displace a huge number of other technologies. Two other examples, and ones that have been briefly alluded to already, would be Alibaba and Amazon. So both of these are digital retailers, and they're allowing organisations to seamlessly provide their products to a huge range of people around the world without needing to worry about warehousing and overheads and some of the complicated supply chain management techniques. Really good example of this, I've got a colleague at work who on the side has developed cat tents. So these are tents that are designed specifically for cats. Sounds a little bit weird, it is very weird, but she's been able to actually go about and produce this particular technology, this new product, has been able to source people in China to produce it, has been able to source warehouses in the US to actually house it, has been able to drop ship it through platforms like Amazon, or without having to leave her living room. And that's a pretty amazing thing that has been able to occur. And that's because a lot of the disruptive organisations that we're seeing are providing technology platforms that empower consumers to do things that they would otherwise not have been able to do. And the third feature that I wanted to draw upon is that technology and the disruptive technology that we're often focusing upon when we think about disruption is actually occurring from a take-up perspective much quicker than what has historically been the case. If we have a look at the telephone, when the telephone hit about 10% market penetration in the US, that would have been approximately 1905. It took another 65 years before it reached about 90% penetration in the US market. So 65 years from 1905 to roughly about 1970 to go from 10% of the population to 90% of the population. If we were to have a look at the technology that replaced it, the cell phone, we can see that there's a much shorter period of diffusion that's actually taken place. So that the first 10% of the population in the US to actually have a cell phone took place in approximately 1995. 10 years later, almost 90% of the US population had it. So we've gone from a 65-year period to go from 10% to 90% for the technology of the telephone to a 10-year period for the same 10% to 90% dissemination to take place for the technology that replaced it. And so this is really scary for organisations and for businesses. It means that it is taking much less time for the disruptive technologies to actually come about and to effectively do away with the incumbent organisations, the incumbent businesses. And so that is a real cause for concern. If you are an incumbent, you might have a very high degree of market share. Doesn't necessarily mean that will always be the case, and that you could find yourself displaced and disrupted in a very quick period of time. The case study, what I want to focus upon, relates to the electricity sector. Now in Australia, and this is a model that's replicated in many countries around the world, we have 3 to 4 major actors. We have a power plant, and this could be from a range of different technologies, whether it be coal-fired power plants, whether it's hydro, whether it's nuclear, whether it's gas-fired power plants. All of these are providing the basis for electricity. We then have a set of distributors, and these are the people in charge of the wires that effectively transport the electricity from the power plants to us living at home and to our businesses. And then we have the business or the household as the end user. And this has been a model that has taken place and been around effectively since the dawn of electricity production and consumption. In about the 1970s, this started to slowly shift. All of a sudden, we had the consumer as a producer through the emergence of solar panels. Now, solar panels typically will sit up on a person's roof and will generate electricity. This didn't cause too much of a concern to power plants or to distributors, at least in the first instance. The reason why is that it was an expensive technology, and it typically was only taken up by people that didn't have access to existing distribution infrastructure, such as people living a long way away from established residential areas. And it was also expensive, so that only people who were very committed environmentalists were typically going out to find solar panels to put up on their roof. That slowly started to change, though, over the next 2 to 3 decades, so that by the late 90s and the early 2000s, solar panels were starting to become both cheaper and also more common. In Australia, at least, there's a thing called a feed-in tariff, and what that means is that the excess electricity that is being distributed via solar panels effectively gets fed back into the distribution network. And that's all fine, it's fantastic. It means that no one is actually being displaced and everyone's relatively happy, because all of a sudden we have a situation where we've got a more amount of electricity in the distribution network without necessarily having to worry about spending more money to establish and develop new power plants. This started to change, though, once the battery became invented. And once commercialisation and innovation and reduction in the size and the cost of batteries allowed households to start to install a battery. Because what that meant is that electricity that had been generated during the day via solar panels could actually be stored. And it effectively meant that it did away with the need both for power plants and also for distribution equipment, so that a person with a solar panel and also with a battery could eventually become an island. They didn't need to actually have access to any of those other types of requirements. So where does that actually leave distributors, and where does that leave power plants? It's particularly concerning for both of those organisations through the emergence of what have become known as mini-grids. Mini-grids mean that a person who has access both to solar panels and also to a battery can effectively trade their excess electricity with each other without needing to have any real access to power plants and even to the distribution network as well. And so this is something that is starting to dramatically transform and disrupt the huge amounts of investment that have been put towards electricity consumption and production and distribution through economies around the world. Now, most of the time, these are still relatively minor startups. These are organisations that haven't had a huge amount of traction because they've only been around for about 2 or 3 years. But if we were to transform, or if we were to look into the future in the next 5 to 10 years, we can see that the age of the centralised power plant and the age of extensive distribution networks could very well be at risk. So, what do distributors do? What is it that they can do to try to head off this risk and to provide a means of ensuring their long-term longevity? So I've been working with one electricity distribution network in Australia, and they have taken a slightly different approach to many others around the world, and it also provides a potential framework for what other organisations can do if faced with potential distribution or disruption issues. The first is that they can supply the technology that allows organisations and individuals to actually produce electricity, to share the electricity with other people, and to, in the process of doing so, leverage their existing distribution network. So the organisation that I'm working with, they're actually selling solar panels. They're selling the batteries. They're also selling the technology that allows people to sell their excess electricity to other consumers, but in the process they've been able to use their existing network infrastructure to be able to still recoup some of the cost, some of the huge amount of investment that they've put into establishing their own poles and wires, the things that translate the electricity that's been produced from one area to the other. Now, that's from an incumbent perspective. Disruptors, because there are disruptors that are around, how have they actually approached this? Well, as part of this particular project, we also interviewed disruptors in this particular space who are developing mini-grids from around the world. And they have effectively approached it from the perspective that from a disruption perspective, it's going to take a little bit of time for their disruption efforts to actually bear fruit. The reason why is that the electricity sector is incredibly regulated. It isn't something which always allows new entrants to come in and to disrupt existing market players in a very seamless or quick manner, simply because of the huge amount of regulation that's taken place. And so they're actually preparing to work with existing distributors to the best of their ability to bring about this new technology, because they see the environmental benefits of it. They see it as something that is incredibly important for organisations to start to foster and adopt. So from a conclusion perspective, knowing that my time is up, there's a couple of things that we can take out from this experience. The first is that organisations can very well co-opt and adopt the technology of disruptors. They can try to incorporate it into their own existing management processes and their way of doing business. The key issue, however, is that leadership must be aware of the fact that by doing so, they could very well cannibalise their existing markets. And that in turn could start to, at least in the short term, undermine their profitability and also undermine potentially their longer term longevity. So there is an element of risk, both of ignoring disruption and also of embracing disruption. But if you don't do it, there is very much the risk that you could find yourself very much the way of the dodo and not being around anymore. So thanks very much.
Friend and colleague, first of all, I would like to thank all of you for inviting me. I would like to thank Bu Dekan, Pak Wakil Dekan, dan Ibu Wakil Dekan for the opportunity. I'm delighted to be here. I will talk about, that's wrong title, but the title is about will Indonesia stuck with a 5% growth during the current disruptive era. So let me explain first what I mean about stuck with a 5% growth. Next. Oh, okay, this one, next one. So if you look at this graph, these are the average growth rate for Indonesia before the crisis, as been mentioned, is actually higher than 7%. And after the crisis, during Pak SBY one period and the second period of Pak SBY, it is closer to 6%. And in the last 3 years, during Pak Jokowi era, in a way, growth rate has been steady at only 5%. And certainly Pak Jokowi would like to have a much higher growth. If you look at his Nawacita program, he would like us to have a 7% growth annually. And Pak Jokowi and his team did try their best, I guess, in pushing the Indonesia to grow higher. Starting from in the early period, Pak Jokowi decided to eliminate energy subsidy to allow more budget for infrastructure. Pak Jokowi produced economic reforms. There are, by now it's already about 15 packages, economic reform, trying to boost Indonesian export and increase investment to Indonesia. Pak Jokowi bring Sri Mulyani, Ibu Sri Mulyani, at that time was the executive director of the World Bank, supposed to be the best Indonesian economist around, to be his chief of economic team, the Minister of Finance. Pak Jokowi trying to push infrastructure program by keep traveling around Indonesia, asking everybody to be fast in implementing their program. So he would like to accelerate infrastructure. But as you can see, Indonesia, in a way, in the last 3 years has been stuck in 5% growth. And so the question is that whether Indonesia, despite of all this internal effort, despite of the global situation, and despite of the current disruption era, will only be able to grow 5%. So let me go next to describe a little bit about why Indonesia have a 5% growth comparing to before we got a much higher growth. If you look at our GDP, component of GDP from expenditure side, you can see that the only one that relatively stable at 5% is private sector consumption. Government budget is increased quite well, but fixed capital formation, which is investment, and net export has been relatively weak. And that is the part that need to be supportive or to be perform better, particularly the investment and the net export. If Indonesia would like to grow higher and Indonesia would like to be a winner in the current disruptive era. If we look at the growth sectoral component, the main issue in the last 3 years that we have this double bust. The first bust is mining. Both of them are due to the declining of commodity prices. The first bust is the mining bust. Our mining revenue declined a lot, and you can see actually mining as negative growth. The second one, the second one, mining is as minus 0.6 growth during Pak Jokowi era. And the second issue is the bust due to declining income from palm oil. This is also because the declining price of palm oil that is making the manufacturing sector could not perform quite well, and the agricultural sector, yes, we have a compensation from other estate crop, but we are not being able to perform rather well. So from the sectoral point of view, one of the main challenge that Indonesia have is how we can compensate the double bust that we have at the moment. It could be if we could be the winner of this disruptive era. Services increases in Indonesia. It's grown rather well, but as been mentioned, what type of services? And at the moment, the services of digital and many services that is actually at a lower level, lower scale, that are growing quite well. And both of them are difficult to be taxed at the moment. And so they are not, so the government cannot really use the growth of this sector to increase government revenue, then later on to invest, to make better investment in infrastructure, to be able to attract more investment. So the current situation is not that good unless we could do something much better. Next. So what is the growth potential of Indonesia? Next. Indonesia usually compared with this country in Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, or in Southeast Asia, Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. Some of them experience almost the same policy as us, and they all are our main competitors in a way in the region, in terms of fighting for a higher export and be a winner of this current digital era. And some of them actually perform better than us in terms of being able to utilize the digital era to push for a higher growth, particularly Philippines and India. But if you look during 2005 until 2014, Indonesia are in between, the growth of Indonesia are in between their growth. So we still relatively comparable, but in 2016 and 2017, most of them are growing higher than us. So I'm using this data set next to see what is the potential growth of Indonesia. So the way that we use to see the potential growth of Indonesia is that during the area in which Indonesia is in between them, which is from 2005 until 2014, we simulate the Indonesian economy using their growth. So we find a formula that basically can predict Indonesian growth during those periods. There are two formulas that we develop, kind of the optimistic and the kind of a bit pessimistic. And you can see that that formula actually could be able to mimic Indonesian growth during 2005 and 2014. Yeah? So the component of that formula is our neighbors' growth. So we use our neighbors to predict Indonesian growth. And during 2005 until 2004, those formula are able to predict Indonesian growth well, using their growth. Now, we forecast Indonesian growth using the same formula, but now for 2016 and 2017. So the predictor are their formula. And you can see if we do that, then Indonesia actually could grow much higher than our current growth. So that means that, those gaps are the effect, the impact of we are having this double bust due to the decline of mining and palm oil revenue, and at the same time we are not able to compensate that decline of revenue. So something that we miss out, which is that gap, according to this model. And that gap is actually could be our potential. Next. Okay, so now I'm talking a little bit faster now about the global situation. Next. So if you look at the global situation, it's not that good. GDP growth globally relatively low at 2%. And export trade between countries has been relatively not good as well. It's not growing quite fast. It's actually declined a little bit and now increased a little bit. And if during this increase, the last year increase, most of the increases is actually trade among the advanced country. So what I'm trying to tell is that the room to expand export has been relatively tight because the world is growing rather slow, and advanced country is actually being able to penetrate a much higher market, increasing their penetration on the global market. Second, next. This is telling about the demand on China. So one of the main global demand come from China. It's certainly yes, US and Europe, but China is the one that people pay attention. And China has been shifting their attitude toward import. It used to be that they are investing domestically, and so when we have the opportunity to import raw material, which is currently still our competitive advantage. But China shifts their composition of their import more toward final good, because the way that they want to boost growth is through increasing domestic consumption and investing abroad. So then the countries that actually could benefit from this shift is the country that more exporting more to China on the form of final good. And Vietnam has been much better than us, and Thailand has been much better than us. So not only for us at the moment, the global situation, not only that the demand for us to export has been relatively limited, but also the change pattern of trade has been changed, and we are not in the position to be able to get advantage of those composition. Next. This is showing that the global commodity price has been going down, and that is one of the issues. Next. Next. Now I'm going to talk about the domestic challenge. The first challenge is that we have an election, upcoming election, and like it or not, the election has created, in a way, a situation of uncertain. So who will be probably certain, but what kind of government that we have after the election is certainly uncertain. And so business cannot predict, an investor particularly cannot predict what will happen, and so they kind of wait and see until the election finishes. Next. Exchange rate is relatively steady, but it's not in a situation in which actually could improve our competitiveness much more efficient. So we need to have an exchange rate that more favorable to our competitiveness, given the global competition has been tight, and it's not happening. The fact that rupiah getting weaker a little bit, we already kind of afraid, although at the current situation we probably need it. Next. The trend of export has not been healthy. Next. Investment realization is increasing a bit, but next, if you compare on investment, our investment in manufacturing compared to India or compared to our competitors, Vietnam, for example, the level of investment in our manufacturing sector has been relatively low. So we are not sure whether we actually could compete in this disruptive era. Next. Next. And the other situation is that credit has been much more difficult because many lenders has been very conservative due to the level of unhealthy credit is increasing. Next. This is showing that our competitor, our business index increased, but so well the other competitors, and they increase higher. Next. And R&D has been certainly weak, and if you look at the budget comparing to our competitors, our budget is relatively low. Next. So what is it in the fiscal policy? What are the opportunities? Next. One of the problems is that our buoyancy, meaning that our revenue has been growing lower than our GDP. So in a way, we are not being able to extract our GDP growth to become an opportunity for us to expand a higher expenditure and more strategic expenditure. Next. And also, capital expenditure in our budget is kind of residual because we already have a fixed proportion for transfer, a fixed proportion for routine, and the room for that has been low. Next. And if you look, we have another issue, which is our deficit cannot be higher than 3%. And if we compare to our competitor, for example, India, have a deficit of about 6%. Sri Lanka high, Thailand is higher, so they all are having, Malaysia is higher, so they all have this flexibility to expand their expenditure while we are actually restricted. Next, I'm just going to the conclusion right now. The final conclusion is as follows. we face this challenge in the disruption era in which we have to be better we have to be able to compete better. And however, we have a lot of challenge globally. The global environment is not that helpful. And domestically, we also has an issue. Credit has not been able to disburse easily because lender has been conservative. The political environment has not been helpful. And our fiscal policy do not have much space to basically booster the economy. However, if we are able to grow by 5%, our consumption would be able to grow by 5%, we might still be able to grow at 5%. Nevertheless, the probability that we will grow lower is, in my opinion, probably higher than the probability if we are going to grow higher than 5%. Thank you.
Okay, because of the time constraint, we have to conclude these sessions. What I want to add further is the technology enable communication, message to be transferred very fast, very easily to many people at times. So, to preparedness of the people, of the populations on the how to accept the message, how to understand what the message that they want to deliver is very critical. So with that, we conclude the session. Thank you for your attention.